Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anna Rowinska, and I am your technical host today. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on trends for the future world of work. If you are having any troubles hearing, please click on the bottom left where you see the microphone icon. Click on the up arrow where you can select various audio controls. Although your microphone is not enabled, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. Thank you to those who pre-submitted your questions already. We will be asking questions throughout the presentation, so please make sure to ask your questions when they come up, and we will feed those to Lisa and John for a great interactive conversation. Our moderator today is Lisa McGuire, founder and CEO of the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Stolo people, part of the Coast Salish region of southwestern British Columbia. For those who don't know us, the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC is a not-for-profit health and safety association serving manufacturers and food processors. We're here to assist you with your health and safety challenges with a competent team to help keep your workers safe. Take a moment to visit our website as we have a number of safety training courses and resources available, on-site or virtual engagements to provide specific needs to assist you, together with information on how to develop a health and safety management system to the Occupational Safety Standard of Excellence, core certification for manufacturing. Our workplaces today have adapted to keep pace with our ever-changing world around us. Maintaining this pace has been exhausting for leaders, employees, our families, and communities. What changes will we see in the transition to the sustainable, healthy workplaces of tomorrow? The success of our businesses will depend on how we make decisions on the design of our work in the shift towards the endemic phase of the pandemic. We need to think differently about how we shape our workplaces to enable our teams and organizations to thrive. Today, we're joined by John Donnie, Senior Director of Thought Leadership from the National Safety Council, who will share recent findings on employers' approaches and workers' attitudes related to the pandemic. Thank you, John, for joining us today. We're excited to hear about the trends we need to be considering and planning for today, insights into where we are today and what the future holds for business and for the health and safety of our workforce. As we move into the presentation this morning, I invite you to write them into the chat as they come to mind. We've built into today's webinar at the end of the session to work through getting your answers today. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Lisa. Great to be here and looking forward to sharing with all of you. As was mentioned briefly there, John Donnie, Senior Director of Thought Leadership at National Safety Council. Going to share a little bit about who I am and what that organization is all about. Appreciate you bearing with me here as I sit here in my office outside of Chicago. Very cold here today. We're hunkering down, getting ready for a large snowstorm that's barreling through North America here. So thanks for bearing with me on that. I'll also say just in advance, if you see a small cat, dog, or child behind me, they all live in my house with me. So there's a pretty good chance at sometime or another that one of the three of them is going to find their way into the camera frame. So apologize for that in advance. But here today to talk is, as Lisa mentioned, a little bit about the future world of work and the trends that we're foreseeing related to that, as well as some of what we're seeing out of just the current state of COVID-19 and the pandemic and that transition into endemic. I think that the session advertises 6. I'll give you 8 trends here for the price of 6. 2 of them I'm only going to talk about very briefly in passing, so hence the focus on 6 of the 8 trends that we've uncovered. So first order of business, really just an agenda here. I'll share a little bit about the NSC and how we got here. I'll share the trends one by one, do a little bit of an upshot on that. So what is I always find helpful on the back of a research oriented presentation that we share a little bit about the practical application of that research, talk about the current state of COVID, and of course, taking questions and answers throughout. Have a lot of content to share. So if I pass by something just in transition here, we will be sharing all the content after the event, and I'm happy to answer questions throughout and after the session as well. So a little bit here about the National Safety Council. We're America's leading nonprofit safety advocate. We've been around since 1913, so a little over 100 years old, closing in on 110 years old here as an organization. We have about 16,000 member companies. Many of them are small and medium size in nature. About 90% of our member companies are under 1,000 employees. So a wide variety of organizations under that remit, including many manufacturers, food processors, and others that are similar to you all here today. And you can see here our mission is to eliminate the leading causes of preventable death and injury so that people can live their fullest lives. And we follow the data and focus those efforts on the places we can make the biggest impact. And at present, we're organized around what we call 3 practice areas: workplace, which is what I'm here today to talk about. But we also do work in roadway and transportation safety, as well as impairment. And I will focus a little bit on that impairment component here in the presentation as we talk about things like well-being and mental health and fatigue and all of those sorts of things that have become part and parcel of the way we work today. And then you can see here as well represented just our blanket, quick hit on who we are, which is that we save lives from the workplace to any place. And for over 100 years, that's been our positioning and our footing. So how did we get here? Long story, but I'll try to make it as short as possible. As we look back now, probably ticking back the clock about 2 years, we're pre-COVID, and we're thinking about where the future of work is. And I apologize because, of course, my dog's chosen this exact moment to go nuts at a squirrel or something out there. But we think about where we were a couple of years back, and of course we were still looking at trends and the emerging world of work even then, right? We aren't looking at it just because of COVID. We had existing conversations going on emerging topics and benchmarking within our Campbell Institute Center of Excellence and our Work to Zero program, which is a safety technology focused effort that we have here at the council. So we were talking with a lot of stakeholders about the future trends of world of work. Of course, COVID-19 came along and really accelerated these conversations. Many of the trends I'm going to share are not unusual or unique to COVID, but they have potentially been giving some fuel and some fire to these trends and accelerating them. So we knew as COVID hit that we needed to, we had a more concrete need to understand our future state, to capture where we'd been and where we were going. And we took a mixed method approach. We've done a number of surveys since the summer and fall of 2020, probably in the double digits in terms of surveys and data that we're feeding into this. Dozens of focused benchmarking sessions cross industry, and hundreds, possibly thousands of conversations at this point with safety and health leaders, operations leaders, other business strategists on where they see the future world of work going. And that led us to this framework here that I'm sharing, which is a pretty packed framework document, maybe a bit of an eye chart. But the upshot is that we looked at 3 major sort of ways in which we're thinking about the future of work. One is the way work's being done, which are work modalities. Second aspect of that is worker expectations and the actual kind of human element of the employee or the worker. And then the third were work enablers, those things that were allowing us to be successful and contributing to our ability to navigate the future of work. So you can see a wide variety of issues across those different buckets. And as we analyze those sort of reduced down into these 8 trends, cross-cutting all of these different aspects. And you can see I've highlighted 6 of them here that we're going to focus on, and 2 I'll just cover in passing, which are sort of the sustainability aspect of the future of work and then the partnership aspect. So this is sort of the seed from which all of this grew, and I'll spend the next hour or so really unpacking this diagram with you.
So John, just as a first impression, it looks pretty overwhelming and complicated, with businesses having a challenge treading water as they cope with so much change.
Mm-hmm.
What is the investment, the time and resources to get started? And do we have to tackle it all at once?
Great question. And yeah, it is overwhelming, I think, even to look at as someone who's been looking at it for the better part of a year plus. It's still a lot to grapple with. And I would say that you absolutely don't need to start with everything. In fact, that's largely not going to be very effective. I think what I would suggest using this framework as a way to pinpoint some hotspots for yourself. Look at this and hold it up against your existing strategy. Don't try to do everything at once or try to completely pivot from where you are, but overlay something like this on top of your existing strategic plan and say, what is on our radar right now? And what are maybe one or two things that aren't on our radar that we think we may need to get conversant with? And I'll also say that our operating perspective as an organization, we're a relatively small nonprofit. We know we can't move all of these balls up the hill at one time. We definitely rely on partnership and engagement with others and experts in these spaces to do some of this work. Just as I would say your organization should look at where it has strength and double down on that, and where it doesn't, maybe seek some external resources. NSC has plenty. I'm sure that other organizations do as well, and go and grab those and use those to begin to get a starting point established. So great question, Lisa. So I'll tick through these in the interest of time, kind of going to move fairly quickly here and try to hit as much of this as I can for you all today. But I'll start by walking through some of these trends one by one. And I'm going to start with one of the ones that's most obvious, I think, to all of us in relationship with COVID, which is lean, distributed, and asynchronous work teams. Essentially meaning that the folks that we're working with are likely to be smaller, all over the place, and not necessarily working at the same time as we're working. And I think that's probably held true for many of us as we've navigated our remote or hybrid environments. But I also know that many of the folks that I'm talking to right now have not had perhaps the luxury since the early days of the pandemic of actually being remote or hybrid, and have in fact been working shoulder to shoulder with their teams in person. So to some degree, you can look at this and say, yes, this may affect part of our organization, particularly kind of the corporate or support service component of our organization. But there is a segment of our workforce that is working just as they did prior. That said, I think we know that this is changing under our feet a little bit, and some of our organizations have certainly been hit by this more so than others. One of the major things that we saw, particularly in the early days of the pandemic and has continued on, is the altered team dynamic that comes with this change. And although this slide focuses on the remote worker environment, I'll say it's just as true of folks who have had to grapple with so many protocol changes in the physical work environment. You were used to maybe coming into your manufacturing facility and going about your typical safety protocols. In all likelihood, those have drastically changed in the past 2 years. The folks that you're working with, some of them may be remote. You're going to be engaging with them in different ways. But for those of us who are in a more pure remote working environment, big changes have happened from day one of the pandemic to now, with a lot of sort of forced listening and not a whole lot of awareness about how to utilize some of the tools that we're using right now, like Zoom, in a really effective fashion. And I think we've gotten better with that, in particular, how we leverage our virtual water cooler and engage with people in a natural sort of fashion, rather than this kind of forced or awkward mechanism that I think Zoom represented for us early on. But we've also seen, certainly this is true in my organization, probably true in many of yours, that a number of folks that we maybe didn't expect to emerge as leaders have found their footing in this new environment and now can work really well in this kind of changed working mode. Unfortunately for some, they can't work as well as they maybe were. They were reliant on the physical workspace and engaged really well there and have struggled with this. So there have been a lot of good studies on this. I put forward some of them here. The Cisco study as well here on how we use our tools now to compensate for some of our lack of face-to-face interaction. But just really grappling with and acknowledging that this has certainly been a big change, and this trend is here to stay for the most part. This study is a little bit outdated. It comes from the latter half of 2021, but you can see here the upshot being that of that group, as Robert Half studied, about a third of folks working from home would look for a new job if required to return to the office full time. Certainly folks are eager to return to some degree, is kind of what we generally see in these studies. 50% might like to work, as you can see here, in a hybrid sort of environment. But there's been a seismic change in the desire or interest in coming back into the office full time. And whether we work primarily in person, as we did before the pandemic, or we're in a hybrid environment, this change will have an impact on us. It may be the impact of working in the field and not being able to go into the office and see your HR person because they're working remote. It might be that sort of small of a twist, but it will be a unique change that will continue to stay with us. And you can see here as we move into Omicron and Delta as well, obviously drove a lot of this change. These are not flash in the pan changes. These are sort of things that are happening at a high level in many tech companies, many forward forward-looking companies have made the decision to allow their entire workforces to continue to work remotely or work in a hybrid capacity going forward. And I know probably a lot of us have sort of seen this perpetuation of a return to work date that we thought was out there, gets kicked down the can by 3 months and maybe 3 months more and 3 months more. And now I think we're all sort of living in this environment where we know that may never really fully come back to fruition in the way it once did. So certainly just a change that we know is here to stay, and something that has many safety implications as well. As we navigate what our changed work environment and interaction is, that brings with it a host of safety and health challenges that we need to grapple with. So that's one major trend, and I pair that up quite often as I share this information with this second trend here around new skills and modes of leadership. And as we look at these hybrid workforces that may be split between in-person and remote, we know that there's going to be new skills that we require as leaders and as safety professionals to manage this workforce effectively. We'll need to be more collaborative, more transparent. We also know that before the pandemic, and certainly still now, more and more millennials are entering more senior roles in their organizations. We have Gen Z making itself seen in the workforce as well. And the needs and the style of these leaders and these employees is very different than those that preceded them. So all of this is not, again, just solely a COVID-related trend, but a trend that has been gaining steam for a number of years now as the demographic of the workforce changes. In the context of what this means for us and what we need to do with it, I think there have already been some really good studies, and I've listed one here from McKinsey in addition to the work we've seen, as to what leaders may need to do to adapt to these new styles of leadership. And you can see here the McKinsey model is to make it credible, feasible, sustainable, and personal. Similarly, the Campbell Institute at National Safety Council and some of the other studies we've done put forward these lessons that we derived on new styles of leadership, communicating the why, valuing different perspectives, wide range of perspectives, growing transparency, and taking tailored approaches for different groups and different individuals. I couch this in the context of hybrids and habit, and there's a reason for that title at the top. I actually display it on this next slide here. Before the pandemic, I spent a lot of time thinking about habit as a safety professional, and probably many of us have been to conferences or seen referenced in articles or think pieces. This book that I have here, The Power of Habit, written by Charles Duhigg, it was a New York Times bestseller, a very powerful book that studied the formation of and the science behind habits. And this was important to us as safety professionals because we were often trying to create habits. We were trying to create better safety and health cultural habits to sort of indoctrinate that into our workforces. So Duhigg posited that the average time it took to form a habit was 66 days, about 2 months. And I think now what we've come to realize is we've spent almost 700 plus days forming some very powerful new habits related to our current work environment. And so there's a huge amount of post-vaccine inertia, even before Delta and Omicron, of folks feeling protected, but not really knowing how protected they were, not knowing how they could integrate back into our previous modes of work. And sort of acknowledging that confusion and trauma is a very, very necessary, very real thing for organizations and for leaders. And certainly now in the context of Delta and Omicron, where we know those protections are different, we know those things are happening that we hoped wouldn't happen, that's really just been perpetuated. So I kind of want to recontextualize our focus on habit here as safety leaders in the context of turning that toward where we've been the last 2 years and what that means for us and what habits we may now need to acknowledge as just things that are part of our everyday working life and maybe habits that we may need to try hard to break. I mentioned that demographic change. I just wanted to illustrate that here for you. You can see that it was around 2017, 2016, when we hit that crest of the millennial population being the majority of our labor force here in the US. And that's continued to grow over the past several years. And we're beginning to see that uptick almost exponentially in the post-millennial or Gen Z demographic. So again, just acknowledging that these groups require very different focuses and ways of approaching them than did boomers or Gen Xers or the silent generation or greatest generation of kind of the World War I, World War II era. So just lots of change there to grapple with. I'll also paste up against that our very normal, very real tendency as humans to fall into sort of cognitive bias traps. And I've listed three here: normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, and the ostrich effect, that I think are particularly relevant to us as we look at the era we're in right now. Underestimating the extent of potential disruption. In our case, that's the disruption caused by COVID, but all these other types of change also cause disruption. Underestimating the amount of time it takes to complete a future task. I think we've all probably fallen prey to that one in our work or personal lives. And looking at good information, or looking at, following good news once you get early good news, but ignoring or trying to hedge out additional negative information. Or if you first receive negative information, you're sort of trying to avoid that and looking for the good news. And that's the ostrich effect. So all three of these are really important to consider as we're thinking about how we address things organizationally and personally as leaders, taking into context all the changes to the work environment, all the changes to demographics, to the habits we formed, these biases that can creep up on us. I would sort of couch all of these under sort of the interpersonal or organizational psychology component of the trend set, and think about how we have to change the way we interact, with our mechanisms of work and with the people that we work with. So that's kind of this first set of the trends, and these two really flow pretty naturally together. And I thought it would make sense to kind of cover those together here.
Really interesting information, John. Just a consideration, different generations having different expectations, certainly a lot of change. How can future workplaces accommodate, so many adaptations and build successful, sustainable organizations?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and not one that I have a perfect answer for, but I honestly do think that COVID has given us a little set of training wheels on that to some degree. I think we've gotten much more used to sort of just meeting people where they are in terms of how they prefer to work, how they prefer to show up, what their style is. We were commenting before we got on this call about, getting some glimpses into people's lives and what's going on, and talking about things. That I think has really opened our eyes to being able to do that well in a way that was uncomfortable for us two years ago. So I'd say leveraging that is going to be a big leg up for your organization, and kind of continuing to ride that wave, even if COVID isn't driving it anymore 6 months from now. Fingers crossed, maybe we'll be in a different place, but not losing sight of the good things that we've gained over the past 2 years and the silver linings. So, thank you for that. I mentioned I was only going to cover 6 of these 8 trends. So this is one that I wanted to touch on, but I won't go deep into, which is certainly we've also seen a big move toward enhanced sustainability efforts and environmental social governance, or ESG sorts of approaches over the past year, 2 years, 3 years in the safety and health space. And I think one of the things that we're paying attention to as an organization is what the role of safety and health leadership is in this conversation, and really doubling down on that social component of sustainability to create a footprint for safety and health. In our view, you can't really be a sustainable organization without being sustainable by your people. And that's really where, to me, safety and health fits into this equation. So there's been a lot said about a focus on sustainability and the footprint reduction that we got from the early days of lockdowns and things of that nature. But I would just posit that this trend is much bigger and more about the holistic viewpoint of sustainability, inclusive of safety and health, as we go forward into the future. So just wanted to make a quick comment on that one. But to turn back to one of the trends I want to go a little bit more deeply into, and I think this does really extend from those first 2 that I mentioned. This move toward transparency, again, has not been brought about by COVID, but it certainly has been accelerated by COVID. And I'll say also in the United States, it's been accelerated by a fair amount of news that you likely have seen on racial justice issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other things that we're grappling with as a country, and that every country grapples with, really. But one that we've been very focused on here in the States over the past couple of years as well. And so I think about that, and really organizations and leaders, individuals, no longer have the luxury of remaining remaining silent on these things and really need to reposition how we approach these topics. And I think Canada offers actually a really fantastic model for the US to follow on some of these things. They've always been a bit more advanced in your approach and thinking about this than we have. But I'm really curious as to how this continues to affect not just organizational messaging and positioning, but our own way of interacting with folks as leaders and as safety professionals in particular. So, just some contextualization to this and some studies that I wanted to share beyond the work we've done where this came up was that, as we looked at this in the context of COVID, culture, communication, and transparency have been the highest drivers of organizational success across this time period. And you can see here that, conversely to what you might think or what I would have thought, the average Glassdoor culture and value ratings actually skyrocketed and went higher than they ever have before on average during the pandemic. In other words, organizations that were really committing to being transparent and communicative were really seeing the dividends of that play out with the way their employees were looking at that messaging. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, you see some results from the MIT Sloan Culture 500 cohort, which is a representative sample of 500 businesses in the US. And essentially what this is showing, and it's graded on a 2 to -2 scale, is that communication and that set of things underneath communication was really the single strongest driver of organizational success during the time period studied here, which was essentially the early part of the pandemic. And that by being more communicative and honest and transparent, organizations were seeing concurrent related success in their retention, in their productivity, in revenue, et cetera. So, we can certainly see that that's been a big driver for success. In terms of how this relates to safety in particular, I think psychological safety is the way I would frame the relevance when it comes to an individual safety effort. As safety and health folks, we've actually talked about psychological safety a lot in the past couple decades without maybe naming it in those terms. When we talk about psychological safety, we talk about being comfortable being a devil's advocate, being able to admit a mistake or being able to point out an issue. These are things that we want out of a safety culture. This is what we build our safety management system to have as an output. We might not have called it this, but now in the context of the pandemic and some of the other work that we're seeing come to the fore around mental health and well-being, this is really caught on conceptually. And so creating that atmosphere of psychological safety as opposed to an atmosphere of psychological danger is one that we really stand behind, and I think is a major trend here. Again, not a new concept. And you look at some of the NASA studies that took place after the major disasters in the 80s and the early 2000s, and they really named psychological safety as the key culprit behind some of these issues. Engineers not feeling comfortable raising their hand and pointing something out because of operational pressure. Again, a very, very, very familiar concept for us as safety and health professionals. And then as far as transparency is concerned, just another, kind of point of interest here. This is actually a chart showing the very rapid rise of investment dollars that are under sort of responsible management. And then there's sort of a standard or principles for responsible investment standard or PRI that sort of tags organizations as responsible spends or sustainable spends. And so this is really just tracking all the investments being made in these organizations in trillions. You can see that meteoric rise from 2006 when sustainability as a movement was just getting started to today, where that's nearly $3 trillion, trillion dollars. So there's just a huge amount of money in sustainable investing and transparent investing right now. And although this might not mean anything individually for us as a leader, I think it's important in that our organizations and our boards and others pay attention to these metrics and obviously understand them. And that rolls down to the way our entities think about treating transparency on the whole, not just organizationally or from a governance perspective, but from a cultural perspective as well. A fifth trend that I wanted to touch on here, and this one is kind of our bread and butter, and I've positioned it at the center of the presentation for that reason, is that, out of all of this, we saw across our many interviews and across all the data we studied, that safety and health is increasingly being embedded at the core of organizational success. And this is not something that we would have ever quibbled with as an organization. Obviously, we've been beating this drum for many, many years and believe that safety and health and productivity are copacetic and enhance one another and not the opposite. But we're finally sort of seeing this now come to bear in the market and come to bear in the minds of our organizational leaders. It used to be that there were sort of few and far between chief executives or operational leaders who maybe understood the true value of safety and health, and I think we've certainly seen that change over the past several years. To illustrate that, and this is another study from that Sloan Culture 500 group, what you can see here is a list of factors that were either strongly negative or strongly positive drivers of success during the pandemic. And the employee welfare bucket, which includes employee health and safety, employee mental well-being, and family-friendly policies, was essentially a wedge issue. If organizations were doing it poorly, they saw extremely negative response to that from their employee base. If they were doing it well, they saw extremely positive response to it, second only to communication, which I had kind of mentioned earlier. So that goes to show the massive value of safety and health during a time like this, when it's very clear and obvious in folks' minds. But I think we've seen that halo effect of safety and health, moving beyond this, okay, we need it because it's a pandemic, into a how do we build our business around this cornerstone of value creation that comes from being a safety and health centric company. And to that point, this is a McKinsey study that shows essentially that as organizations looked at grappling with the pandemic, they intend to go and double down on this. And at the bottom, you can see that 83% of respondents believe that they will be hiring more people in health and safety as a result of what we've seen over the past several years. And you can see that on the top, increase in hiring since the pandemic, almost a 50% increase in hiring in workforce health and safety, second only to things like on-site sanitation. So there's been a massive boom in organizational focus here. And I think our challenge and our onus now is to not walk away from this and not to allow this to simply be something that rose and fell because of the pandemic, but how we continue to lead the way as safety and health practitioners and leaders. And so, that's kind of what I share here. And I've got one of our many tools that we put together to help organizations as they navigate this next phase of the pandemic. There's really this ongoing need for environmental health and safety to lead the way. We've been on this roller coaster for 2 years now, and certainly organizational change was a very real thing prior to that. So how do we as safety and health leaders continue to be that shining light for our organizations, which they've relied on, as we've been that true north for so many of our CEOs and our COOs as we've gone into this. How do we maintain that value? How do we continue to put a risk-based lens on everything? And how do we overcome that initiative fatigue of, this is the new thing that we're caring about today? And we've seen that over the years in safety and health. You've got a hand safety issue, you launch a hand safety program, and it begins to feel like, a flavor of the month to some degree. How do we not allow that to happen coming out of the pandemic? And I think we see a lot of good talk about organizations continuing to carry on this mantle. It's now really our role as leaders and individuals to make that commitment stick and to do what we can to continue to show our value and prove our worth as we go forward.
Excellent point, John, and really looking at health and safety as a DNA of our businesses. You spoke of the importance of building physically and psychologically safe workplaces and the need for more health and safety professionals to support them. What new skills, knowledge, and capabilities will be important for the health and safety professionals to help, equip businesses for success?
That's a fantastic question. And the one I thought a lot about even before the pandemic. The way I look at it, and this is my personal perspective, is, safety is just as much a technical profession as it is a people profession. And we've long talked about the need for safety and health leaders to bolster their people side of the equation and understand how to become good leaders and not just good leaders in safety. And so I think that's even more true today than it was 2 years ago, that our need to meet people where they are and to really show up as people leaders first and safety leaders as well is sort of what I would posit as the new skill set that's necessary. And certainly just the ability to be flexible and agile. And certainly that's a good skill set to have no matter what. But in this current day and age, certainly being able to leverage that is bigger than it ever was before. Not an easy task, easy to say, as a set of things that you need to do, a lot harder to get there. In the interest of time, I'll kind of carry through here. I know I'm about halfway through my content, so we're about halfway through the presentation, which seems good time-wise here. I want to switch to, as we think about that whole person piece, very much, again, I think this is a place where businesses in Canada have done a whole lot more than many in the States. And I look at Europe and Australia and other places, really as leading the conversation here on valuing the whole person. But this is a trend that I think has, again, seen a lot of attention due to COVID, but has been a trend for quite some time, and I think is going to continue to be a trend. So when we thinking about the whole person, mental health, well-being, maybe we have some basic programs in place to address this, but what we need to do is really grow that muscle to the same extent that we've grown our physical safety muscle over the years. So you could look at something like this, the total worker health set of issues, essentially, that was derived from NIOSH here in the States and the CDC. I think when I look at this, I put this up here, not jokingly, but more so to say that when you look at things through a total worker health or a whole person lens, you really honestly begin to look at everything. You begin to look at the built environment, you begin to look at communities, you begin to look at compensation and work-life balance, you begin to look at how work is organized, you begin to look at policies, work arrangement, technology, you name it. Really, you start to have to try to boil the ocean. So it's hugely challenging to think through things in that lens and widen that scope. And so, this is a great starting point. Eventually, you do need to pare down and focus on those things that you may need to really get deeper on. And a few years back now, the Campbell Institute released this white paper that sort of laid out a potential systemic approach for well-being and valuing the whole person. And this is just a sample chart. It's not meant to be actually indicative of data here. But what I think we recognized in research was we do a lot of risk mapping from a safety and health perspective, typically on very discrete and concrete safety risks, material risks that we can quantify. It tends to be harder to do this from a whole person perspective. It tends to be harder to sort of risk map or heat map stress and fatigue against tobacco usage, against the risk of depression, because the outcomes of those things can be very different. For individuals, they can be very different based on comorbidities. They can be different timelines of risk. Tobacco usage might come about as a risk factor over 20 or 30 years, whereas stress or fatigue could be something that hits in a moment and really needs to be addressed on that day. So really what the upshot of this research work was to posit that organizations at least need to start putting some parameters around this and think about getting to a risk basis approach on well-being. And only by doing that will they be able to cut away the chaff of all the many issues they could work on and prioritize those few that address their populations. So the idea here would be to generate some data, anonymized and privatized as needed, on your health risk as an organization, and use that to go after risk much as we do for physical risk and safety. So that's a starting point perhaps that organizations could use. I also put up here some studies from Kaiser Family Foundation that lay out really just the scope of the mental health crisis in the US, and this is mirrored in other parts of the world. Again, COVID is a big driver of this, but you could look at this and say even prior to COVID, you look at these numbers, 11% of adults were reporting symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorder prior to COVID. That's 10% of your working population. During COVID, in the height of it, 40%. Those numbers have ticked downward a bit, but they're nowhere near where they were at one point. So they're still extremely elevated. And I would say even if their baseline number, that's a significant risk. If 1 in 10 of your employees is at risk for something, you're generally going to pay attention. So these are really significant numbers to grapple with. NSC does have some tools that can be used, a fatigue calculator, a cost calculator for substance use, for mental health, that can give your organization a sense of the scope for you and where your pain points might be there, and maybe can be used to convince leadership that might need a financial read on this as to how they can approach this. I'll also share, I mentioned opioids and impairment. We've been tracking and doing work on these numbers. This is the rise in opioid substance use deaths, drug overdose deaths in the States. So you can see that meteoric rise that comes with the pandemic. But even before that, we were certainly not in a very good place. And I know that from chatting with some of the folks here prior to this conversation, this is true as well in BC, and that those numbers are rising monumentally for you all as well. So would encourage you to check out NSC's resources on that. We have a lot of great content, research, and tools that can be used for supervisor, sort of substance misuse training, things of that nature that can be used to help address this issue for your organizations. So something that we're continuing to track and look at every day. Two other trends I wanted to dive into really quickly before I turn over to kind of COVID particular conversation. One is technology as a mandate. We all use technology, no doubt. Our organizations have technology strategies and initiatives, but even again, before COVID, there was this conversation about digital transformation and how we were moving into Industry 4.0 and Safety 4.0, leveraging these tools. And what we've certainly found now is that the early adopters of technology, those who were well positioned prior to the pandemic, saw a huge boon during the pandemic. And really the pandemic just happened to be the precipitating event that led to that outcome. But this could have been anything that would have shown the differentiation between those who are really ready to leverage technology and those who weren't. Some slides and some studies that kind of help us contextualize that, essentially from both McKinsey and from others, showing that those who were really ready and felt that they were first in their industry to be positioned on certain technologies were generally more effective in responding to COVID-19. They were able to implement their responses effectively, to be agile, to utilize technology to fill gaps as needed. Those who were well positioned, now looking at what's here to stay, that increase in remote work, the increased use of technology for operations, for business decision making. Most organizations have a pretty strong belief that these things are going to stick and stay relevant for us going forward. So there's a need to invest here and continue to do this work. And on the safety aspect of this particularly, we have a whole program called Work to Zero that looks at technology as it relates to fatality and serious injury prevention. And so we've mapped the 20 biggest causes of fatal injuries in the US data set and looked at technologies that can apply to these and be adopted by organizations, and started to put together tools and resource guides for organizations who want to dig into that. So you can engage with all these resources. They're free for you to go check out and utilize as it relates to safety and health, particular technology interventions. And then just in the context of COVID, and something that we're grappling with as well is, with this rise in technology and rise of information availability, there's really an increasing organizational need to have a point of view and understand how you manage technology and information and misinformation in your organization. So the WHO put together this little infographic of, they believe organizations need to have a designated infodemic manager, person who's responsible for helping their organization understand what's true and what isn't, and what's out there that's real and what isn't. They call the infodemic an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. And what are safety and health professionals if not, hopefully, trustworthy sources of reliable guidance, right? So we really need to think about how we can cut across this. And this comes up in our day-to-day interaction with the vaccination conversation, certainly, but it equally applies to just about any issue that you want to bring up in the workplace. And as we think about our cultures organizationally going forward, we will have to grapple with this. It's not something that's going to go away when the pandemic ends. It's a continued just evolution in our society. I mentioned that there were 8 trends here. So just to close the book on that last trend here, we've also seen a huge rise in both internal and external partnerships. as a way of grappling with the more, do more with less kind of trend generally, but particular to COVID, how do we tackle these big issues that none of us can solve on our own, right? So I would just say that as a safety and health professional has been really rewarding, because I've been able to work with folks that I never would have before and engage with issues that, we've been able to show up and prove the worth and prove the value of safety and health as a lens on some of these things, with economists, with folks who are working on massive public health infrastructure issues, with folks who are thinking about how to solve community challenges. So I would say, this is not, again, not going away. And, one of the silver linings for us, but also maybe a double-edged sword, is that we've done a pretty good job in a lot of places of solving issues that have arisen from a safety and health perspective. That will be remembered for good and for ill. It's a good thing that we've done it. It's also sort of an implicit trust that we'll do it again next time. So we're not going to be let off the hook the next time there's a challenge. We're going to be looked at to rise to the occasion and solve it again. So that's just something to keep in mind for the next one of these black swan events that comes up, that if we solved it well the first time, the expectation is we'll solve it the next time. So that's a sort of a whirlwind tour, I think, of many of these trends here that I wanted to cover.
Thank you, John. A wealth of information. With the shift to hybrid models and a new way of working, how much more difficult is it to establish a workplace culture when the home life is so close to work, and the traditional water cool discussion that you mentioned earlier, doesn't occur as frequently? So your touch points are more two-dimensional than three-dimensional.
Yeah, it's a serious challenge, and one that we're grappling with in our organization as well, right? I think what I've found, and this is just my personal experience, some of and what I've heard from many, is that the things that we think of traditionally, the kind of activities, the outings, the picnics, the all staff meetings where you can kind of see awareness happening in real time or see the culture building in real time, those are really not going to come back very quickly. Those may sporadically be things that we can leverage as we start to come back into the work environment. Where we maybe need to pick up the slack is in using some of these online tools more deeply that we have. And an example I'll give you, in my work team, we use Microsoft Teams, we use Slack, we use Discord, we use all sorts of different sort of chat and workflow sorts of tools. We've established across each of those with all of my different teams sort of support channels so that folks can feel empowered to come into a channel and just talk about what's on their mind with no preconceived notion. And that's been surprisingly effective. And I do this with my own friends and personal relationships too. Just knowing that there are people out there going through the same things and being able to talk through some of the things that we would normally just have a chat with someone over lunch when we need to on demand through a platform can be really powerful if you can build the culture of acceptance there. And it takes some bravery. It takes putting yourself out there and maybe being an example yourself of being willing to open up and share something. But once you've been able to build that sort of foothold there, it's been surprisingly powerful and replaced a fair amount of that in-person culture building with my teams. And I've built over the pandemic entire work teams that have never met each other in person. So whether that's long-term, the path to success, I don't know. I don't know how long that's sustainable for, but certainly at least in the interim, that's been a helpful tool to use. So thanks, Lisa, for those questions. I'm going to just briefly switch over. I have a few slides that I'd like to share on sort of the takeaways from this work, and then transition briefly into some of the COVID specific content. So, just to sum up where we've been with what I just shared, I think it's a positive thing that there's a spotlight on safety and health. Our values clearer than ever. We've expanded our roles and responsibilities. We're interacting with lots of new folks in our organization and taken on all sorts of things over the past couple of years. We're in this unique position now to transform our organization. But each of those things is really the other side of the coin here. We've got many expansions of our role that creates role confusion and dilution. Are we now expected to be the mental health and culture folks in our organization? What's our role when it comes to engaging with HR, with our risk counterparts, with our facilities folks? Where does our role end and another role begin? How do we sustain the change management, just pace that we've had over the past couple of years? How do we, make that complexity a good thing rather than a challenging thing, because you look at a bowl of spaghetti and there's two ways of looking at it. One is that it's massively confusing and we'll never untangle it, and the other way to look at it is you've just got to start somewhere and pull a thread and start going. So that's kind of, I think, the good and bad of where we are, and what I take away from our current moment. What we're going to do from here on the NSC side is continue to grow our tool set for you, whether that's from SAFER, which is our COVID-19 initiative, or Work to Zero, which is our technology initiative, or our perception survey work that we do. We will leverage those tools out there and make them more available for all of you. We'll also continue to do research on these particular topics from a research to practice lens of how you actually take these things that we're seeing emerge as trends and implement them in your organization. So psychological safety, great concept. What do you do with it? How do you actually turn it from something we know we need to build into an action that we can actually see in the field and roll out to supervisors or leaders to establish in their work? So that's kind of where our focus will be over the next couple of years. And I've listed some upcoming research that you can see here, but there's plenty of other content that we're putting forward and tools that are out there for us.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John, for
Sure.
sharing experience and insight, a wealth of information. So starting with the audience Q&A period, please, I invite you to put your questions into the chat. Really looking forward to hearing from you on the questions for John. One of the first insights really speak to how do we get this to the leadership? How do we get this in a package that we can translate for, to influence that change?
Right. It's a good question. So, I mean, I think that's where you need to leverage. You've got this spotlight at the moment where hopefully you've been asked to put a lot of weight in the game here on COVID-19 response, develop plans, develop strategy, and then change that strategy on a daily basis as things have moved. Hopefully that's built some trust. It's probably built some negative interactions over the course of that time as well, where you've butted heads on things. I think for leaders, it tends for me to start with a clarity of how this relates to operational efficiency and financials, right? So speaking that language is really important. And that's why I've referenced things like cost calculators or other tools that we have out there that can go from saying, hey, we know this is the right thing to do as a safety and health initiative to here's the material impact it will have on the business, from a productivity perspective or an absenteeism, presenteeism mitigation, whatever the case may be. So packaging it with here's the concept, and here's some studies that prove the concept is real. Some of the stuff I've been sharing today is great fodder for that. If you show a CEO, here's some studies from McKinsey and MIT that share why this is important. Here's what other organizations are doing. Here's some research to back it up. Then, here's how this, here's what this segment is for us. It's probably not the entire thing, but here's the segment of this that we can go execute on. That's really how I would think about packaging this. And hopefully some of the cost calculators and things that we have out there will allow you to get concrete numbers that you can attach to that. And that's always useful. So it's a mix of, showing folks what's out there, showing folks what others are doing, and then giving very real actionable numbers and attaching those to that for leaders.
Excellent, John. Yeah, that translation factor really important to be able to influence, just change, right, decisions. A question on, really complementing, the tips available for work teams that have access, to computers and technology. But what about those workplaces that are working on the floor, as you mentioned at the beginning, the manufacturing communities, those similar communities where they are on the job every day and they don't have access to technology, and where those large gatherings aren't occurring. So how do you get that communication happening? What are the strategies?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And I'll say, I'll also just think we need to be transparent in saying, as we go back into this new world, this next world of the endemic phase of the pandemic, perhaps, there's going to be some potential very real intercultural resentment or issues that we need to deal with as we go into that. I've had the benefit of being able to work from home, and I acknowledge that as a benefit and a luxury. And I haven't been shoulder to shoulder with my colleagues. And for those who have been putting themselves in harm's way every day, the world has looked very different over the past couple of years. And as we get back together, whether you have technology or not, that's almost secondary to the fact that we will have to grapple with reconnecting with folks and kind of moving toward a new normal. We're not going to be in the state of flux forever. Do I know exactly how long we're going to continue to be in the state of flux? No, I just know it won't be forever. So we will have to grapple with that. And in terms of how technology or lack thereof can help, I mean, I'm always a proponent of not saying technology has to be the solution. If you've got a small organization where the resource intensity is just such that some of these higher hanging technology pieces are just not realistic, I'm not saying, no one's saying go after them to when you don't know what the return is going to be. What we're trying to do is, especially for small and medium-sized businesses, provide those case studies or efficacy studies for folks so they know this thing does or doesn't work, and here's how you implement it, so that you can have that solid footing on which to stand before you go into a decision to go after something. An example that might be exoskeletons, or you name the technology investment. But if you're a small business, you don't have the bandwidth to go say, let's lay out tens of thousands of dollars to go buy some exoskeletons just to see if they work. That's just not a feasible proposition for you. But if you see a case study from us that says, for this type of work, it has a good result, or for this type of work, it doesn't, then you may be able to make some decisions on the spot about what things you do go after. So I think it becomes a prioritization game. It also becomes a game where you don't need to feel like you're behind just because you can't do the flashy thing that an ExxonMobil or a Dow or a big company that has a ton of resources is doing. But maybe you can use a nugget from those organizations to inform the work you're doing today. And that's kind of where I think NSC and other nonprofit organizations play a big role, is to help to translate those things from the resource-rich organizations downstream into those of us who just every day have to kind of come to work and grapple with what we have. And our own organization is like that. We don't have infinite resources, so we need to think about where the few things that we want to go spend our money on and time and attention on lie, and go after those. So that's how I would say starting the conversation would be where I recommend going. And then again, just more broadly, technology or not, thinking about how, as we get toward this new normalization process, thinking about the nuances of that within our cultures, and knowing that there's going to be a long tail of kind of just getting folks back into one harmonious group and thought process.
Thanks, John. There's a question about, the current state with COVID. Can you elaborate more? And you talked about that and alluded to one of your slides that really talked about our current state. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, I have a few slides here on the back end that I haven't shared, but I can tick over to one or two of them here. This is sort of, we're doing regular organizational studies right now on a monthly basis on sort of where we are with organizations and then with workforces to understand what are companies doing from a control and mitigation perspective, and what does the workforce think about those control measures, or just generally about the state of the pandemic. So ticking through to what we're seeing as being effective, and this is maybe current state, these are the things that we're seeing as being the highest efficacy in terms of controlling case rate within our group. So my apologies. You can see ventilation, remote work, space between shifts, testing at home and at site entry tend to have the biggest correlation to reduce case rates. So that's kind of where we're seeing is what's ultimately proven out to be effective. And I think obviously in the early days of the pandemic, we were placing much more focus on physical sanitation, and made the realization along the way that ventilation and filtration are really what we want to go after when it comes to being effective. So we've got a whole swath of good information out there on that. And then looking at considerations for what you do in the future, basically rolling out from those things that are seen as effective. I could go into vaccine mandates and requirements till my face was blue, so I won't belabor that. But I'll mention, here's another takeaway from that when we were looking at our employee base, almost 100% of organizations were asking for employees who are in person to be vaccinated, or encouraging or requiring it, and then much less so for remote contractors and guests. And then, going forward, we know there's a need for us to combat not just Zoom fatigue, but organizational change fatigue in general, and do a lot of work to facilitate team cohesion, promote health and well-being, and really establish what we've been doing over the past couple of years as a continuing ongoing function, forming a permanent crisis response team if we don't have one, being on the lookout for the next thing, whether it's infectious disease or not, is really, really important. And then one last thing I'll say just to the current arc. I mean, I think we're all probably tracking, the massive surge and now decline that we're starting to see in parts of the world. And that's where the US at least is in the curve. Regardless of the fact that we're on the decline, our number of cases is 8 to 10 times higher than it was even at the previous peak surge that we saw. The jury still seems to be out on, are we really at that moment where we transition from pandemic to endemic? I think there's a lot of optimism that we're going to get a little bit of a reprieve here in the next few months. If the variants stop coming for a little bit and Omicron really is less severe and we really are getting a massive level of immunity, good, bad, or indifferent from vaccine and from natural infection, then we might be at a place where we're battered, but we're coming out of it with a realization of what the new normal might look like. We've been here before. I mean, we were here in probably June of last year when we sort of thought we saw the light at the end of the tunnel. So I'd say organizations need to be prepared for 3 different scenarios. One is we really do trend toward endemic and we're in a good spot. Another is that we're basically where we are right now and we continue to see these ebbs and flows. And the other is we get another really intense surge and things go down the rabbit hole. We've got a more severe variant, whatever else may happen. We need to stay out of that biased viewpoint of being ready for just one of those 3 things because it's the one we want, and be ready to react to any of those 3 scenarios that may occur.
Well, thank you, John. We're going to have to stop here. An extraordinary discussion, and thank you to everyone for their great questions. It is an intriguing topic and one that continues to evolve. The information you provided us that will be available to all of you has given us new perspectives to consider in preparing our workplaces for tomorrow. So thank you. If we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to respond to some of them in the follow-up in today's session. A reminder about our upcoming webinar, please join us on February 24th at 11 a.m. for Working with Machines, Risk, Prevention, and Safety with Cobots and Automation. Additional resources are available on our website, so make sure to visit our media library for on-demand content, news, and resources and event information. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please check your inbox for a survey link to share your feedback and suggestions to help us improve future webinars. We'll email you tomorrow with a link to the recorded webinar, slides, and related resources. Thank you all, and take care.